I think the first thing to say is, of course, that Mr. Hunt was presented with a slightly better fiscal outlook than he faced in November. But don't forget, it's still much worse than we expected a year ago. It's very much too easy to compare these numbers with the most recent ones. Actually, looking back even a little way in history is quite important. Mr. Hunt decided to spend the larger part of the windfall that he's got since November. But note the difference with what happened in November. Then the forecast got much worse. He just lived with the extra borrowing. So if they get better and you borrow when you use the extra borrowing, they get worse and you keep the extra borrowing. That's how borrowing ratchets up year on year. The two big ticket items were a childcare offer for the under threes and a temporary full expensing for investments in corporation tax. There was more money for defence and the traditional, and this time particularly expensive, cut in the real terms level of fuel duty. As far as the economic forecasts are concerned, the OBR are much more positive than the Bank of England and than many other forecasters about medium-term growth. The Chancellor should be grateful at least for that small mercy. But to repeat what I said back in November, it is slightly odd. I don't know if it's damaging, but it's certainly slightly odd that we have our monetary policy and our fiscal policy made on the basis of two extremely different economic forecasts. Despite those relatively somewhat better economic forecasts over at least the short run, the outlook for the public finances does still look difficult. Tax continues to rise to its highest ever level and to much higher levels than in recent decades. Yet, even with very tight spending penciled in from 2024, debt is barely falling. And that's because a high debt level, high debt interest payments, additions to debt not included in borrowing, and sluggish nominal growth make it hard to get debt on a decisively downward path. And this really matters. To quote the OBR, it is now harder for this Chancellor to deliver a falling path for the debt to GDP ratio in the medium term than it has been for any of his predecessors since the OBR was established in 2010. That's quite a statement, not least remembering where we were back in 2010. As a result, Mr. Hunt was hemmed in by his own fiscal target to get debt falling in the last year of the forecast period. While its level, the level of debt that is expected to be lower than in November, the trajectory remains stubbornly flat. And that has led him to rely on a combination of tight spending plans, imaginary future increases in fuel duties, and a fiscal gain from unwillingly undoing his corporation tax change at the end of the period in order to appear to meet this rule. This is not a terribly sensible way of being guided by such rules. That said, this budget did lay out some elements of a sensible strategy to support growth. There's plenty to quibble with, and I will quibble, but if you want to focus on growth, there's at least some of what you might want here, attempting to deal with incentives to work and to invest. Now, much of the focus was on getting more people back to work. The OBR rewarded the Chancellor by suggesting he might have some success in this, but the numbers are modest. If the total effect of the measures is indeed to get just over 100,000 more people into work, as the OBR suggests, and let's be clear, that is a very uncertain forecast. That would be just a fraction of the number lost from the workforce in the last couple of years alone. It's dwarfed by annual net immigration numbers assumed at 245,000. Even the change in assumptions about migration increases the numbers in work by 160,000 over the period. The OBR reckon the overall labour supply package will cost about $7 billion a year and increase employment by around 110,000. That's a cost of nearly 70,000 per job. Obviously, the money will do other things like provide childcare, but given the Chancellor's focus on increasing the numbers of jobs, I think that's an interesting calculation to make.